The folder arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under the door of Vivienne Ashby's office like it was nothing. Like it was just another contract, another set of terms to review, another piece of paper that didn't really matter. She picked it up without hurrying, she read the cover page. Then she sat down very carefully in her chair. Her father-in-law had made his move. Vivienne Kellner had married into the Ashby family 3 years ago on a rainy Saturday in October, in a ceremony held at a venue the Ashbys had rented specifically because their own estate was, as Edmund Ashby put it, currently between renovations. She had worn her mother's pearl earrings. She had smiled in every photograph. She had shaken hands with people whose names she would spend the next 2 years quietly researching. She had known what she was walking into. That was the part nobody ever understood about her. Edmund Ashby was the kind of man who believed his last name was a credential. He had built Ashby Capital Partners 30 years ago from a mid-size inheritance and a talent for finding companies that were just desperate enough to accept his terms. The firm managed close to $400 million in assets, held equity stakes in 11 regional businesses, and maintained a reputation in certain circles that was built less on performance and more on the discomfort of crossing Edmund directly. He was not cruel in obvious ways. He was the kind of man who smiled while he was diminishing you, who offered a compliment that was really an inventory of your deficiencies, who used the word practical when he meant mine. His son Reeve was 37, handsome in the way of men who have never had to try very hard, and genuinely kind in small doses. He loved Vivienne. She knew that. It was just that his love had always operated within the space his father allowed him, and that space had been shrinking for years without Reeve fully noticing. Vivienne had noticed on their third date. She had liked him anyway. That was not a contradiction. People were complicated. She understood that Reeve was someone who had been taught that loyalty to family was the same thing as loyalty to Edmund. And she had made peace with that early, before the wedding, before she had moved her things into the Ashby house in Raleigh and started learning which hallways to avoid when Edmund was on the phone. She had also quietly started building something he would never see coming. The folder contained a shareholder agreement. It was 15 pages, drafted by Edmund's longtime attorney, a man named Whitfield who wore bow ties and had the energy of someone who had never once been wrong about anything. The agreement was addressed to Vivienne directly. Its terms were simple in the way that only very punishing things manage to be simple. She was being asked to relinquish any future claim to equity or voting interest in Ashby Capital Partners, effective immediately, in exchange for what the document called continued partnership within the Ashby family enterprise. In exchange for her marriage remaining intact, in other words. She read it twice. She set it on the corner of her desk. She poured herself a glass of water from the carafe by the window and stood there for a moment, looking out at the parking structure across the street. At the ordinary Tuesday afternoon happening below her, and she thought about the first thing her father had ever told her about negotiation. He said, "The person who asks you to sign something always wants something they don't already have. Figure out what that is before you pick up the pen." Her father, Leonard Kellner, had spent 40 years in private equity before anyone in his circle had heard the name Ashby. He had retired 6 years ago, handed over day-to-day operations, and moved to Sedona, where he grew tomatoes and read history books, and called Vivienne every Sunday morning to ask how she was eating. He had not attended the wedding. She had not asked him to. There were things between them that were still being worked out, old silences from years when she had been trying to prove something to herself. And they were getting there, slowly, the way people do when they love each other but are also both very stubborn. He did not know what she had been doing for the last 18 months. She had not told him. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she had wanted, just once, to finish something on her own. The thing Edmund Ashby did not know about Vivienne was that she had spent 11 years before her marriage working in acquisitions at a firm called Caldwell Brent, and that she was very good at it. Not good in the way that gets mentioned at dinner parties. Good in the way that means you can read a balance sheet and immediately understand what the person who made it is afraid of. Good in the way that means you notice when a company's asset base is inflated against its actual liquidity. When the story being told in the annual report is a different story than the one in the footnotes. She had been doing that with Ashby Capital for 2 years. The picture that emerged was not flattering. 3 of the 11 equity stakes were significantly underwater. 2 others were being carried on the books at valuations that would not survive scrutiny. Edmund had taken a substantial loan against the firm's real estate holdings 18 months ago, collateralized against a portfolio that was already leveraged, and the terms of that loan required a liquidity event within 24 months, or Edmund would be forced to sell assets at a loss that would effectively end the firm as it existed. He needed a clean balance sheet. He needed the appearance of stability. And there was one thing sitting on his books that was not performing the way he needed it to perform. A mid-size logistics company called Merit Freight out of Charlotte, that had been in the portfolio for 4 years, and was bleeding quietly in a way that was just contained enough to stay off the radar. He needed a buyer for Merit Freight who would pay full price, no questions, fast. Vivienne had become that buyer 8 months ago. She had done it through a holding company that existed in the name of a trust, the kind of layered structure that took a certain kind of patience to build, and an even rarer kind to maintain without telling anyone. She had used her own money, carefully over time, the savings from 11 years of a career that Edmund had never once asked about, because he had decided before he met her that she was the woman his son had chosen without asking permission, which made her in his taxonomy someone to be managed rather than understood. She had made the approach through an intermediary. She had signed a letter of intent in a name that meant nothing to Edmund. She had waited. The deal was almost closed, 48 hours from signing. Edmund's own attorneys had reviewed the purchase agreement and signed off. Whitfield himself had initialed the term sheet without realizing that the entity on the other side of the table was run by the woman his client was, at this exact moment, trying to coerce into signing away her rights. Reeve called her at noon. She knew from his voice before he said anything what kind of call this was. There was a particular quality to Reeve when he had been talking to his father, a slight thinning, like something had been pressed out of him. He says it's standard practice, Reeve said. For spouses who aren't involved in the business. I'm aware of what he said. Did he ask you to call me? A pause. Long enough. He thought it might be better coming from me. She watched a pigeon land on the ledge outside her window. It looked at her with the complete indifference of something that has survived by being uninteresting. She had always found that instructive. Reeve, she said, has your father told you what's happening with the firm's liquidity position? Another pause. Different texture. He says things are fine. Things are not fine. Viv, you don't really. I do, actually. She kept her voice even. I've been watching the financials for 2 years. 3 of your fund's positions are effectively insolvent. The loan against the Raleigh portfolio comes due in 14 months. And your father is currently in the process of selling Merit Freight to an entity he does not realize I control. The silence that followed was the kind that changes the shape of a room. What did you just say? I said I'm the buyer, Reeve. Not me personally. A holding company I've been building since a few months after we got married. I wasn't planning to tell you like this. I was actually planning to tell you Sunday, over dinner, after it closed. She could hear him breathing. Why, he finally said. Why would you do that without telling me? She thought about the question. It deserved a real answer. Because I watched your father hand you this folder and I watched you drive over to the office to deliver it to me. And I needed to know before anything else happened whether you would do that. Whether you'd carry his water that far. She paused. I needed to know what I was dealing with. That's not fair, I know, I'm sorry, but it's true. He didn't answer. She heard the familiar sound of his hand pressing against his face, the way he did when something was too much to process standing up. What happens now, he said. That depends on a few things, she said. Starting with whether you're calling me because your father asked you to, or because you actually want to know. Another long pause. I want to know, he said quietly. Then come home tonight, she said, and don't tell him you called me. Edmund called her himself at 2:30. She had been expecting it. She let it ring, which was exactly the amount of time it took for Edmund to decide someone was either weak or disrespectful, and she had learned years ago that the second option made him more careful. Vivienne. His voice had that particular warmth that was actually a form of pressure. I imagine you've had a chance to look at the agreement. I have. Good. I think you'll find the terms are more than reasonable given the circumstances. Which circumstances are those, Edmund? A brief pause. He didn't like direct questions. They interrupted his rhythm. The circumstances of your place in this family, he said, and what that means going forward. She let that sit for a moment. Outside, the pigeon had been joined by 2 more. Small parliament. I want to ask you something, she said, and I'd like you to answer it honestly. Of course. When did you first find out that Reeve and I were serious, that it was going to be a marriage? About a year before the wedding, I suppose. Why? And in that year, did you ever ask him anything about me? About my work, my background, what I'd spent the previous decade doing? He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. I knew you worked in finance, he said, with the slight dismissiveness of a man summarizing something he found unimportant. I worked in acquisitions at Caldwell Brent for 11 years, she said. I closed 17 deals. I ran due diligence on over 40 companies. One of them in my last year there was a mid-size logistics firm in the Carolinas that your firm took a position in about 6 months after I flagged it as undervalued. She paused. That was Merit Freight. I knew that company before you did, Edmund. The silence on the line was different now, heavier. What are you saying? I'm saying that the buyer your attorneys have been negotiating with for the last 3 months is a holding company called Kellner Voss Partners. And I'm saying that I am Kellner Voss Partners. She heard his breathing change. That's not possible. It's very possible. It took about 18 months and required a level of patience that I will admit was not always easy to maintain. She glanced at the folder still sitting on the corner of her desk. I want you to think about what this means, Edmund, not emotionally. Practically. The way you've always asked other people to think. He said nothing. You need this sale to close, she said. Your loan terms require it. Your Q3 reporting requires it. And the buyer is sitting in your son's house in Raleigh, holding a document you sent her this morning asking her to sign away her rights. She let that land. I haven't decided yet whether to close the deal. He stopped, started again. This is leverage. This is information, she said. What you do with it is up to you. She did not hear from Edmund again that day. Whitfield called at 4, the bowtie energy audible even through the phone, and asked whether she'd had a chance to review the shareholder agreement, and she told him she'd be in touch. And she set her phone face down on her desk and sat very still for a few minutes. She thought about her father. She thought about a conversation they'd had when she was 24. The year she got her first real job in finance. The year she had started to understand that the world she was entering had rooms she wasn't expected to walk into. Her father had told her then that the most powerful position in any negotiation was the one where you already knew the answer to every question they were about to ask. Build your knowledge quietly, he'd said. Let them underestimate the homework. She hadn't talked to him in almost 2 weeks. She picked up her phone. He answered on the second ring, Vivienne. His voice was the same as it had always been, unhurried, like someone who had decided a long time ago that most things worth knowing could be understood without rushing. Hi? Dad? You sound like something happened? Something happened, she said. She told him. Not everything. Not the 18 months of architecture, but enough. She told him about the folder. She told him about Edmund. She told him about Kellner Voss and Merit Freight and the phone call at 2:30. She told him about Reeve. When she finished, her father was quiet for a moment. Did he come home, he asked. Not yet. It's not 6. But you think he will? I think he will, she said. Another pause. Comfortable. You didn't need to do all of that, you know, her father said. You could have just left. I know, but you wanted him to see it, Edmund. You wanted him to understand what he'd missed. She looked at the folder on her desk. At the pigeon still on the ledge, immovable, committed. I wanted to know if Reeve would choose, she said. That's the real answer. Everything else was just preparation. Her father made a sound that was almost a laugh. You sound like your mother. I take that as a compliment. It is one, he said. Reeve came home at 6:15. He set his keys on the counter the way he always did, a small careful sound, and she was in the kitchen and she heard him stand in the hallway for a moment before he came in. He looked tired. He looked like someone who had spent the afternoon taking apart something he thought he understood, and finding the pieces didn't fit back together the same way. He sat down at the kitchen table. She put a glass of water in front of him. He called you after I did, Reeve said. It wasn't a question. 2:30. What did you say to him? The truth. Reeve turned the glass slowly in his hands. He had a habit of doing that when he was thinking small rotations, like he was checking something for flaws. He's furious, Reeve said. He called me after he talked to you, he said. He stopped. He said a lot of things, I imagine. He wants me to ask you to walk away from the deal. I know. Are you going to? She sat down across from him. She looked at her husband, the man she had chosen and chosen again in various configurations over 3 years, and she thought about what it cost to keep choosing someone and what it cost not to. That depends, she said. On what? On whether you're asking me as his messenger or as my husband. He looked at her for a long time. She didn't look away. Your husband, he said. Then no, she said. I'm not walking away from the deal, but I'm also not going to use it as a weapon. I'm going to close it at fair value, exactly as negotiated, and your father's firm is going to get what it needs to stabilize. Because the alternative is that the firm collapses in 14 months, and the people who work there lose their jobs, and your father spends his last years watching something he built fall apart, and I don't actually want that. She paused. Even now. Reeve put the glass down. Then what do you want? I want him to know, she said simply. That's all. I want Edmund to know that he looked at me for 3 years and never saw me. Not because I was as invisible, because he decided not to look. She folded her hands on the table. And I want you to know that I'm not the person he told you I was. I'm not someone who needs to be managed. I'm someone you married, and there's a difference. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. I know that, he said quietly. I've always known that. Then, why did you bring me the folder? His hand didn't move. Because I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't, he said. Which is not the same thing as agreeing with him, but I know it felt the same from where you were standing, and I'm sorry for that. She turned her hand over under his, palm to palm. Okay, she said. Okay? Okay, she said again. That's enough. That's what I needed to hear. The deal closed on Thursday. Kellner Voss Partners acquired Merit Freight at the agreed-upon price. Edmund Ashby received the liquidity his balance sheet required. Whitfield filed the paperwork with his bow tie perfectly knotted and no discernible awareness of what had transpired. The transaction was documented, settled, and complete. The shareholder agreement stayed on the corner of Vivienne's desk for 3 more days. Then she put it through the shredder in the copy room because she did not need to keep it. She already knew what it said. She already knew what it meant. Edmund did not call to apologize. She had not expected him to. Men like Edmund did not apologize in the way that language usually means. What he did instead, 2 weeks later, was ask Reeve and Vivienne to dinner at the house. And when Vivienne arrived, he greeted her at the door himself, which he had not done before, and he said, "You look well." Which was, from Edmund, something close to everything she said. "Thank you, Edmund. You too." And they went inside, and dinner was served. And nobody mentioned Merit Freight or Kellner-Voss, or the folder, or the phone call. At 2:30, some things get settled without being spoken, which is its own kind of fluency, and Vivienne had always been good with language. She had grown up learning that quiet was not the same as empty, that patience was not the same as powerless, that the most important information in any room is usually held by the person nobody thought to ask. The dinner plates were cleared. The wine was poured. Edmund Ashby sat at the head of his table and looked at his daughter-in-law, and for the first time in 3 years, he did not look through her. He was not sure what he was seeing, but he was finally looking. That was enough. That was, in the end, exactly enough.